She walked out on the poor fisherman. 2 years later, he bought the company she worked for. Imagine coming home, heart full of hope after a triumphant day, only to find 2 packed suitcases by your door. The person you loved looked you dead in the eye and declared, "I deserve more than a fisherman." But here's the twist that will truly shock you. 2 years later, that very same person would be knocking on a stranger's door, desperate for a job, utterly unaware whose world she was about to re-enter. Jonas had just returned from the sea, his boat so full of fish it was almost sinking. He tied his rope to the usual post and practically flew up the dirt path to his house, calling her name, the salty scent of the ocean still clinging to his clothes. That's when he saw them. 2 suitcases leaning against the front door. Camila sat on the doorstep, wearing her best dress, her hair neatly tied back, looking like she'd rehearsed this moment countless times. He laughed, thinking it was a joke. He started talking about the amazing catch. The fishing was incredible. We can finally fix the engine now, and we'll even have some money left over. She just raised her hand, silencing him. In front of 2 neighbors who were helping unload the fish crates, she stated flatly, "I'm tired, Jonas. I deserve more than a fisherman." The fish were still wriggling in the styrofoam box. No one moved in the yard. And what no one knew in that instant was that 2 years later, it would be her knocking on a door, begging for a chance, having no idea who owned the place. Jonas took a few stunned seconds to respond. The wet net was still tangled in his fingers as the 2 neighbors stared anywhere but at him, their eyes fixed on random spots in the yard. "More than a fisherman?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze locked on her, searching for any flicker of doubt, any sign she might change her mind. "Or more than me?" Camila didn't flinch. "Both, Jonas. Because for a long time now, one has become the other for you." He shook his head, trying to process it. "Camila, I don't understand. We were doing well. I'm building something." "Building what?" she asked, her voice low, but each word landing like a stone. "An older boat every year? An engine that breaks down every time we need it most?" "I counted coins for medicine last month, Jonas. Counted coins." "It'll get better," he said, the same phrase he'd repeated since they first met. His voice still searching for a certainty he no longer felt. "You've been saying that since I was 16. Her voice trembled for the first time, not from weakness, but from sheer, accumulated exhaustion. I waited. I waited for the tide to turn, waited for the engine to last a bit longer, waited for winter to pass. There's always a "it'll get better" on your lips, and never a date for it to happen. "You're building a better boat," she continued, her voice now firmer. "I want to build a life, and what we've built so far doesn't count." "It doesn't count?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion, looking at her, unable to fathom how it had come to this without him ever noticing. Camila slowly shook her head, her eyes dry, as if she'd cried all the tears she had to cry somewhere else, long ago. "It counts," she said, "but it's not enough, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life waiting for it to be enough for myself." "I want to build a life too," he said, almost pleading with his eyes, even if his voice wouldn't let him beg. "Me too," she replied. "I just don't want to wait my whole life for it to begin." One of the neighbors awkwardly lowered his head. The other clutched the styrofoam box tighter, just to have something to do with his hands. Jonas felt his face burn, but he didn't scream, didn't truly beg. He stood rooted there, watching her rise, pick up the 2 suitcases, and walk to the car already waiting at the corner, a rented car that would take her to the bus station. He didn't run after her. He just stood in the middle of the yard, the net still dripping salt water onto the packed earth, watching the car disappear around the bend of the dirt road. The fish continued to thrash in the box. It was only after the sound of the engine completely faded that Jonas finally bent down, picked up the styrofoam box, and carried it into the house slowly, as if each movement weighed twice as much. That night, he barely slept. He sat on the porch of his simple house in the village, staring at the dark sea, replaying everything Camila had said over the past months, without him realizing the true weight of it. The comments about the village's small horizons, the questions about whether he ever thought of doing anything else with his life. He dismissed them as simply her being tired, something that would pass. He never imagined he was watching the final months of a marriage. He remembered his grandfather, who had raised him alone after his mother left early. His grandfather always repeated the same phrase while mending nets on the dock, his thick, firm fingers working the nylon with a patience Jonas could never quite imitate. The sea doesn't fail those who know how to respect it. Jonas grew up believing that, like a compass. He knew how to read the water, like few others in the village. He knew where the croaker hid after the full moon. He could predict the tide just by watching the birds fly. But perhaps, he thought that night, he knew how to read the sea better than he knew how to read his own life. The next day, before the sun rose, Jonas got up, put on his usual clothes, and went to the beach. He wasn't chasing her, not looking for explanations. He simply tied his net to the boat, pushed it into the water, and went out to sea as he did every day of his life. Only this time, as he rowed, a different question began to take shape in his head. Why did he always sell his fish at the same low price to the middleman, when it took so much work to catch? He looked at the empty box at the bottom of the boat and thought about how much time he lost every month, giving his fish to someone who resold it for triple the value without ever getting their hands dirty with salt. Maybe there was a way to sell directly. Maybe there was a way to make that work worth more than it ever had. The water was calm that morning, almost like a mirror, reflecting the sky that still mixed orange with a deep blue on the horizon. Jonas rowed slowly, without any rush, letting his thoughts run free, for the first time in a long time. He also remembered Camila, younger, sitting on the wooden dock, swinging her legs, waiting for him to return. That image still stung, but it didn't paralyze him as it had the night before. It was just a small thought, almost formless, but it was the first step of something Jonas couldn't even imagine the scale of. Meanwhile, far away, inside a bus speeding towards Florianopolis, Camila looked out the window, determined never to look back. She had no idea what was beginning to grow, all on its own, back in the village. And she certainly didn't imagine that 2 years later, his name would appear right in front of her eyes, in the most unexpected place possible. 2 weeks after leaving the village, Camila was settled in a small room in Florianopolis, sharing rent with a cousin who had lived in the city for years. The place wasn't big, but it had hot showers every day and a window overlooking a busy street, full of cars and people rushing by. It was exactly the kind of life she had always envisioned for herself, even if it was still far from the comfort she dreamed of. It was this same cousin who, without much effort, secured her a receptionist position at a medium-sized seafood distributor. The owner was a man named Cassio, in his mid-40s, always well-dressed, with an apartment on the waterfront and an imported car parked in front of the office. Camila entered her first day of work enchanted by it all. The air conditioning, the coffee brewed in a fancy machine, Cassio's confident way of speaking, as if he never doubted anything in life. It was all so different from the smell of fresh fish and the dirt yard where she used to live. Back in the village, Jonas didn't just wallow in what had happened. He woke early, went to sea, returned, and in his free hours, he began to think more about that idea that had sparked the morning after she left. He always sold his fish to the same middleman, a man who paid little and sold high to city restaurants. One day, without telling anyone, Jonas took a portion of his catch, put it in a thermal box, and took a bus to a small restaurant near the center of Florianopolis. He spoke directly with the owner, showed him the fish, explained that he fished carefully, without waste, always fresh. The owner liked his approach and closed the deal right then and there for that single delivery. By cutting out the middleman, Jonas earned 800 reis more than he normally would have. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to prove something important. It was possible to do things differently. He returned to the village that day with a smile he hadn't worn in weeks, feeling that perhaps he had found a path, even if small, even if uncertain. On the way back, sitting on the bus bench with the empty thermal box on his lap, Jonas jotted down the names of restaurants near that neighborhood in an old notebook, along with a phone number he got from the owner himself. He didn't know if he'd use it again so soon, but he saved it like a useful tool, unsure exactly when he'd need it again. The news reached Camila a few weeks later, the way these things always do in small towns. through the same cousin, who still kept in touch with people from the village. They were having coffee at a bakery near work when the cousin casually mentioned that Jonas had managed to sell fish directly to a restaurant, bypassing the usual middleman. Camila let out a short laugh, almost without thinking, and stirred her coffee before replying. "Selling fish to a restaurant doesn't turn anyone into an entrepreneur," she said with a tone that mixed sarcasm with a hint of pity. "He'll still be a fisherman his whole life. Just now he'll be riding a bus with a styrofoam box." The cousin laughed along, unaware how important that phrase would become later. Camila finished her coffee, said goodbye, and returned to the office, where Cassio awaited her with a pile of orders to organize. She liked that rhythm, that feeling of being part of a place that always seemed to be moving, always growing. Back in the village, Jonas told Osmar, the widowed fisherman who was his grandfather's old partner, about the successful delivery. Osmar, a man of few words but sharp eyes, listened carefully before speaking. "That's good, my boy," Osmar said, sitting on a wooden stool near the net stretched out to dry. "But you can't do this alone, negotiating with every restaurant by hand, with no proper place to keep the fish fresh. One of these days, the heat will spoil everything before you can sell it." Jonas knew Osmar was right. There was no point in getting good contracts if he couldn't keep the fish fresh until delivery. He spent the following days thinking about it, doing mental calculations, looking at the money he had saved, trying to figure out if he could invest in something bigger without going broke. It was on one of those nights, sitting on the porch, looking at the dark sea, as he had since Camila left, that Jonas had the idea that would change everything. He remembered a large industrial freezer that a merchant in a neighboring town was selling used, for a price he could pay in installments. If he could get that freezer and a space to keep it, he could keep the fish fresh longer, sell to more than one restaurant, without having to race against the clock every time he returned from the sea. He went to find Osmar the next day, early in the morning before even coffee. He explained the whole idea, from the freezer to the space, and asked if Osmar would be willing to join him as a partner, using the unused zinc shed behind his house. Osmar was silent for a moment, looking at the sea, the way only someone who has fished their whole life knows how to look. Then he looked at Jonas and spoke a single sentence that stayed in the young man's mind for a long time afterward. "Your grandfather always said you had the right eye for the sea. I think it's time to see if you have the right eye for the rest too." It was while measuring the door frame that Jonas realized the first real problem. The industrial freezer he wanted to buy wouldn't fit through the shed's entrance as it was. Osmar suggested taking the entire door off its hinges, but that meant leaving everything open for a few days, vulnerable to rain and the corrosive salt air that rusted any metal too quickly. They decided to wait for the weekend, when everything could be resolved in one morning, without risk. Jonas felt his chest tighten in a good way, different from the pain he'd carried since Camila left. He didn't know yet that that borrowed zinc shed with a freezer bought on credit was just the first brick of something much bigger. And he also didn't know that on the other side of the city, inside a well-kept office, his name was about to start circulating in a way no one there expected. The freezer arrived on a Saturday afternoon, brought by a small truck that barely managed to navigate the village's dirt road. Jonas and Osmar spent almost 3 hours fitting the equipment inside the shed, adjusting cables, testing sockets, cleaning every corner before plugging it in for the first time. When the motor began to hum and cold air flowed out, the two stood there, watching, as if that low sound was the most beautiful thing they had seen in a long time. In the following weeks, the small business truly began to function. Jonas fished in the morning, stored the fresh fish in the makeshift freezer, packed it in simple bags, and personally delivered it to the restaurants that already knew his work. It wasn't much yet, a zinc shed with a used freezer and a wooden table for cleaning fish, but it was his, built with his own hands, without relying on anyone else. Each delivery became a ritual, almost always a race against the clock. Jonas separated the fish right on the dock, washed it carefully, packed it in bags labeled with each restaurant's name, and set off cycling on an old bicycle adapted with a thermal box strapped to the rack, since the money to buy a van was still a distant dream. On one of these deliveries, a tire punctured 10 minutes from the restaurant that complained most about delays. Jonas pushed the bicycle the rest of the way, running, the ice melting faster inside the box than he could walk, arriving breathless just minutes before the agreed time. The owner didn't even notice the struggle. He only saw the fresh fish arriving on time, as always. Months passed, and Camila's life took exactly the shape she had always desired. At the distributor, Cassio invited her to take on the role of administrative assistant, handling orders, supplier contacts, and scheduling. Her salary improved, as did her colleagues' respect, and her relationship with Cassio grew more serious each week. He was attentive. He took her to dinner at nice places, spoke of plans to expand the business to other cities in the region. A few months later, he invited her to move in with him in a new apartment, closer to the city center. Camila accepted without a second thought, feeling that she had finally achieved the stability she had sought since leaving the village. It was while she was settled in this apartment, on a Saturday morning, that the news reached her through her cousin, the way these things always reach the village. Over the phone, a little awkwardly, as if she knew the subject would provoke laughter. He set up some kind of cold storage behind Osmar's house, the cousin said. A borrowed shed with a freezer bought on credit. Camila was sitting at the kitchen table, tidying up the breakfast dishes. She shook her head, barely paying full attention to the conversation. A borrowed shed and a used freezer is now a business? She asked with a short laugh. It's still the same old thing, just with a fancier name. The cousin laughed along, unaware that phrase would be stored somewhere in Camila's memory, waiting for the right moment to return. In the village, however, things weren't always as smooth as they seemed from afar. One of Jonas's first clients, the owner of a medium-sized restaurant near the center, called to complain about a 2-hour delivery delay caused by a problem with the boat's engine, which Jonas still didn't have money to replace. The man warned, bluntly, that if it happened again, he would look for another supplier. Jonas spent the next night sleepless, wondering how to resolve it without spending the little he had saved. He went to talk to Osmar early in the morning, sharing his concern. You can't promise a specific time if the boat can't handle it, Osmar said, slowly stirring his coffee. Better to promise a specific day and always deliver than to promise a specific time and fail once in a while. The advice made sense to Jonas. He reorganized deliveries, adjusting schedules with each restaurant, allowing a greater margin of safety. The complaining client was satisfied with the change and continued to buy, unaware that that small crisis had almost cost Jonas the entire contract. It was during this period that Jonas learned, on his own, the difference between working hard and working smart. He started writing everything down in a simple notebook, details of each delivery, quantity sold, what each restaurant usually ordered most. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was enough to stop relying solely on memory and enough to realize, week after week, that the small business was slowly but surely transitioning from being a stroke of luck to becoming a routine. While Jonas was adjusting his routine in the village, a small incident happened at the office where Camila worked, without her giving it much importance at the time. An old client of Cassio's distributor called to place an order, and in the middle of the conversation, commented that some waterfront restaurants were starting to prefer smaller, more specialized suppliers who delivered fresh fish directly, without going through the large distributor. Camila jotted down the comment on a scrap of paper, thinking it was just a random complaint, and passed the message to Cassio later, without dwelling on the subject. Small suppliers can't handle demand for long, Cassio said, shrugging as he signed some papers at his desk. They disappear after a few months. Camila agreed without much thought, returned to work, and forgot about the comment that same afternoon. She had no idea that the kind of small supplier the client mentioned was exactly the path Jonas was building, brick by brick, on the other side of the bay. Back in the village, after solving the delivery problem, Jonas began to notice something curious during his pre-dawn outings. At a certain time of year, a specific type of shrimp appeared in large quantities in the deepest part of the bay, at an hour almost no one in the village usually fished. Most fishermen preferred to sleep at that time, considering it risky to go out so early for uncertain results. Jonas, however, was curious. He talked to Osmar about the possibility, heard old stories from his grandfather about that type of fishing, and decided he would test it, even knowing it could mean weeks of going out with no guarantee of results. If it works, he told Osmar, as they arranged the net the night before the first test, We could secure contracts with more restaurants than we can imagine. Osmar just nodded, trusting the instinct of the young man who knew the sea better than any other in the village. That dawn, under a still dark sky, Jonas pushed his boat into the water, unaware that that test would become the moment that separated the small zinc shed business from the future that was about to take shape. The first few weeks of testing were difficult. Jonas would go out at dawn, row to the deepest part of the bay, cast his net, and almost always return with little to show for it. Twice he almost gave up, thinking perhaps it was just a confused memory of his grandfather's old stories, with no real basis. On those empty-handed dawns, the cold seemed sharper, his body more tired, and the urge to return to bed before sunrise became difficult to ignore. Even so, he returned every dawn, testing a different spot, a different time, noting each attempt in the notebook that had become part of his routine. It was in the fourth week, on a new moon, that the shrimp finally appeared in quantities he had never seen before. The net came back, so heavy he needed Osmar's help to pull it to the side of the boat. From that day on, Jonas began to organize his outings according to the lunar calendar, guarding that knowledge like a valuable secret. The fresh shrimp became a new product to offer, different from what other local fishermen sold. In a few months, his revenue tripled, and fixed contracts grew from 3 to 5 restaurants, all wanting to secure a portion of that supply before another competitor appeared. It was at this moment of rapid growth that the first big scare came. Jonas decided to invest almost everything he had saved in a stronger engine for the boat, as the old one couldn't handle so many consecutive outings, and also in a second freezer to cope with the increased demand. 2 weeks after installation, a strong storm hit the coast of the village during a night of fishing. The new net tore in several places, and a part of the newly installed engine cracked from the impact of the waves against the hull. Jonas returned to shore drenched to the bone, the boat swaying from side to side, his heart pounding more with anger than fear. The damage consumed almost all the money he had left in cash. He spent days sitting on the pier at dawn, staring at the dark sea, wondering if he had invested too quickly, if he had gotten carried away by the euphoria of growth, without properly considering the risks. Osmar, concerned, went to talk to him on one of those dawns. "Every business that grows fast goes through a scare like this," Osmar said, sitting beside him on the pier. "The difference is what you do after the scare." Jonas listened in silence, not responding immediately. The next day, he started selling what he could, without compromising the main contracts. He postponed purchases that could wait and spent 6 weeks carefully managing every cent, personally delivering every order, to ensure no client was dissatisfied during that tight period. They were weeks of little sleep and many mental calculations. Jonas learned to negotiate terms with the mechanic who fixed the engine, to wait a little longer to replace the torn net, to divide every reel between what was urgent and what could wait another month. Osmar helped whenever he could, lending tools, offering opinions, holding steady when the fatigue seemed greater than the will to continue. Slowly, the cash flow recovered, not through any miracle, but simply through discipline repeated every day. Meanwhile, at the distributor where Camila worked, a phone call changed everything, though no one realized it at the time. A restaurant owner on the waterfront called, asking precisely for that out-of-season shrimp that only a specific supplier could deliver right then. "I need to speak to the supplier who can get this shrimp now," the client said. "I already got the contact from another restaurant. The name is Jonas Almeida, from the village." Camila was entering the order into a spreadsheet when she heard the name. Her pen stopped mid-word. She stared at the computer screen for a moment, processing each syllable before slowly continuing to type, as if she needed to confirm to herself that she had heard correctly. It was at that exact moment that Cassio walked past her desk, carrying a folder of documents, and noticed her strange way of looking at the screen. "Who is it?" he asked curiously, stopping beside her chair. "My ex-husband," she replied, trying to keep her voice normal. Cassio let out a short laugh, with no malice in his voice, more from surprise than mockery. "That fisherman?" he asked, already moving back to his own office. Camila shrugged and returned the laugh, trying to appear as if it meant nothing. But for an instant, alone at her desk, she stared at his name written on the screen, remembering the last time she had seen Jonas standing in the middle of the yard, holding the wet net. She shook her head, closed the spreadsheet, and continued her work, storing that moment in some corner of her memory, still not understanding why it had disturbed her so much. In the village, completely unaware of any of this, Jonas managed, in the 14th month since starting his small business, to close his biggest contract yet. A large waterfront restaurant, known for the quality of its dishes, decided to buy directly from him after the owner himself went to the dock to taste the product personally. 14,000 reis a month, a value that, months ago, seemed impossible to imagine. Jonas signed the contract sitting at a simple wooden table inside the zinc shed, with Osmar beside him, smiling from ear to ear. It was the first time since Camila had left that he felt he had truly built something solid, something that didn't depend on luck or a single good fishing trip. What Jonas still didn't know was that, unwittingly, he had just entered, for the first time, the radar of the world Camila had chosen the day she packed her bags. And that name, casually mentioned in a phone call, would continue to echo in her mind for much longer than either of them imagined at that moment. The following months brought steady growth for Jonas. With the biggest contract signed and the second freezer working properly, he hired his first permanent employee to help with fish separation and packing. 2 months later, he hired a second. The zinc shed, which once seemed too large for the little activity at the beginning, now began to feel cramped with the number of orders arriving every week. It was during this same period that one of Cassio's oldest clients decided to cancel their contract after months of complaining about delivery delays and unannounced price adjustments. The cancellation form passed through Camila's desk before going to the finance department, and the name of the new supplier chosen by the client was clearly written in the comments section, the same name that had appeared before in that phone call. This time, she didn't laugh, didn't make any comments aloud. She stared at the paper for a few seconds, feeling a strange tightening in her chest before filing the document in the correct folder and continuing with the rest of her work, as if nothing had happened. The crisis at Cassio's distributor didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces through Camila's daily routine. First, a shrimp supplier called, agitated, demanding an overdue payment that was already 3 weeks late. Camila tried to calm the man on the other end of the line, promising to check with finance, still not understanding that this delay was not an isolated incident. Days later, an old client, tired of waiting for deliveries that never arrived on time, called to cancel the contract right then and there, without compromise. Camila hung up the phone and stared at her desk for a moment, feeling for the first time that this entire mechanism, which had always seemed so solid, could break. Aline, who had worked as a secretary for years, resigned on a Monday morning, tired of making excuses on the phone every time a supplier called to demand payment. Camila watched her quietly pack her things and felt a mix of envy and fear, without quite understanding which feeling was stronger. In the following days, she had to take on much of the work Aline left behind, trying to hold on to orders and suppliers, while Cassio increasingly shut himself in his office, avoiding conversation with everyone. The end came swiftly. The bank called in the loan for the main warehouse, and Cassio had no way to pay. He lost the building, lost the remaining contracts, and the confidence he always exuded effortlessly vanished along with everything else. Camila and Cassio separated a few weeks later, without a big fight, with nothing of value left to divide between them. What weighed most on her wasn't the separation itself, but realizing how much of that life she had chosen depended on a structure that had crumbled in a few months. She had to leave the apartment on the waterfront and move back in with the same cousin, in a much simpler place than she had been accustomed to in recent months. She wore the same few outfits repeatedly each week, making sure everything was clean and presentable, even without being able to buy new things. It wasn't easy, but she kept going, sending resumes for any administrative position that appeared, trying to rebuild some stability before the little money she had saved ran out completely. It was during one of these searches, sitting at a plastic table in the shared kitchen, that Camila saw an advertisement on a job board. A frozen fish distributor needed someone to handle customer service and order organization. The address was in an industrial district on the other side of the city, far from any neighborhood she associated with the village. Jonas had set up his distribution center there precisely to be closer to larger clients, leaving the zinc shed as just an initial storage point. The company name also meant nothing to her. Jonas had registered the business with its own commercial name, chosen with Osmar in the early months, without using his own surname. It was just one more vacancy among many she had applied for in recent weeks. She read the description carefully. They asked for experience with orders, suppliers, and difficult customer service. Exactly the kind of work she had done for almost 2 years. The salary offered was reasonable, enough to restart with a little more peace of mind. Without thinking twice, she filled out the form and sent her updated resume. 2 days later, she received a response scheduling an interview for the following week. Camila felt a small, but real, relief upon reading the message. She spent the following days preparing, reviewing the answers she would give, carefully choosing the most presentable clothes she still had saved, a dress borrowed from her cousin that fit almost perfectly. The night before the interview, sitting on the narrow bed in the shared room, Camila rehearsed her answer softly, trying to remember every detail of the experience she had accumulated in the last 2 years. How she organized delayed orders, how she dealt with suppliers who promised and didn't deliver, how she kept calm when a client yelled on the phone for no reason. She didn't have a fancy diploma or a resume full of courses, but she had real, day-to-day experience, and that, she repeated softly to herself, also counted. On the morning of the interview, she walked to the indicated address, a large, well-organized warehouse, very different from what she imagined when thinking of a regional frozen fish distributor. She entered the reception, was greeted by a polite employee, and sat in a simple, clean waiting room with a comfortable chair and a clock ticking away the minutes until her scheduled time. She adjusted her dress on her legs, took a deep breath, trying to control the nervousness of someone who desperately needed this opportunity to work out. She looked around to occupy her mind while waiting, and it was then that she noticed a photograph hanging on the wall behind the empty desk, an old black and white image of a man mending a net on a wooden dock. Something about that face seemed familiar, but she still couldn't understand why that discomfort was beginning to grow inside her chest. Camila stood up from the chair, drawn by that photograph, as if an invisible thread pulled her closer. She walked slowly to the wall, looking carefully at the man mending the net in the old image, his wrinkled face, his thick, working hands, the way he held the needle between his fingers. It was only after a few seconds that she recognized who it was: Jonas's grandfather. Her heart raced. She looked at the background of the photograph, at the scenery behind the man, and recognized the wooden dock with its worn planks and the boat-tying post leaning slightly to the left. It was the same dock where she used to sit years ago, waiting for Jonas to return from the sea in the late afternoon, when they were just 2 young people dating in the village. She took a step back, trying to understand what this meant, when she heard footsteps coming down the hallway. She turned her head and saw Jonas entering the room with a clipboard in his hand, the same calm way of walking she remembered, but now with a firmer posture, like someone accustomed to solving problems every day. He didn't seem surprised to see her there. He had read her full name on the resume hours earlier when he organized the week's candidate list and recognized her instantly. He chose not to say anything to anyone about it, just to wait for the interview moment to arrive naturally. The night before, he had spent a long time staring at that name on the computer screen, unsure exactly what to feel. It wasn't anger, it was more a quiet curiosity about who that woman had become after everything. Camila stood frozen in the middle of the room, not knowing where to put her hands, her face hot with shame and surprise all at once. For an instant, they just looked at each other without saying anything, the silence weighing heavier than any words could. "Camila," Jonas said, his voice calm, without any hint of sarcasm or hidden anger. "I didn't know," she replied quickly, almost apologizing. "The ad didn't have the company's proper name, just the address. And I didn't make the connection." Jonas slowly shook his head, indicating the chair in front of his desk. "Please sit down," he said, maintaining the same tranquil tone. She sat down slowly, as if the chair might disappear beneath her at any moment. The office was simple but organized. A bookshelf with labeled folders, a wall calendar marked with delivery dates, a small fan running in the corner, spinning slowly. Nothing there suggested luxury, but everything had a clear purpose, the kind of organization that only exists when someone builds every detail with their own hands, without extra money to waste on decorations. Camila sat, her hands clasped together in her lap, looking at him, then at the photograph on the wall, trying to understand how that dirt yard had become this organized office with a security plaque on the wall and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Jonas placed the clipboard on the desk, but didn't open her resume yet. He looked at her for a serious moment, weighing his words before speaking. "Before we continue," he said, "I need to ask you something. Do you truly want to proceed with this interview?" The question caught Camila by surprise. She expected anything but that. She expected sarcasm, perhaps a disguised accusation, maybe even a hidden smile of victory behind his politeness. But what Jonas offered was an exit door, making it clear, without saying it directly, that she could get up and leave, without any explanation, without more embarrassment than she already felt. She looked again at the photograph on the wall, at his grandfather mending the net, and then looked at Jonas, trying to understand what that silent invitation truly meant. She remembered the yard, the suitcases, the words she had spoken in front of the neighbors. She also remembered the past months, the sleepless nights wondering how to pay the rent, the job applications that led nowhere, the feeling of running out of options. She could get up, thank him, and leave, pretending this encounter had never happened. But she needed this job. She truly needed it, without mincing words, without pride disguised as dignity. And for the first time since she had left the village, she felt she needed to say it aloud to him, without equivocation. "I want to continue," she said, her voice a little shaky at first, but growing firmer as the words came out. "I need this opportunity, Jonas. I would really like to work here if you believe I am capable." Jonas remained silent for a few seconds, looking at her without visible judgment on his face, only evaluating in the way he evaluated any important decision in life, calmly and without rush. He didn't smile triumphantly, didn't make comments about the past, didn't bring up any of the phrases she had said that day in the yard. "Then, let's do the interview," he replied simply, pulling her resume closer and beginning to read it carefully. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Jonas asked objective questions about her experience at the previous distributor, about how she dealt with difficult clients, about how she organized orders when several suppliers were late at the same time. Camila answered carefully, trying to demonstrate the real work she had done, without inventing anything, without exaggerating competencies she didn't possess. As she spoke, Jonas noted some points on the clipboard, listening with genuine attention. He didn't mention the past once, just asked question after question, the way he would with any other candidate that week. Near the end of the conversation, Jonas closed the clipboard and looked at her for a moment before speaking. "I need to evaluate a few more candidates this week," he said with sincerity. "But you have real experience, that's a fact. I'll give you an answer soon." Camila thanked him, shook his hand firmly, trying to hide how much her legs were still trembling inside, and left the office, walking slowly to the street, unsure exactly what to feel. Relief at having said what she needed to say, shame for how much she had changed since the last time they had looked at each other like that. And a question that wouldn't leave her head throughout the entire journey back home. Would he really hire her after everything? The next 2 days passed slowly for Camila. She avoided looking at her phone too much, afraid of becoming too anxious, waiting for a response that might never come. She helped her cousin with small household chores, reviewed her resume for other vacancies, trying not to put all her hope in a single place. But deep down she knew that this job had become different from all the others she had applied for. In the village, Jonas spent those same days carefully analyzing the other candidates who had also applied for the position. He didn't want to make a decision based on any old feelings, neither hidden anger nor disguised pity. He talked to Osmar about the process, without going into detail about who Camila was, just asking for general advice on how to choose well who would work closely with him every day. "Choose who knows how to do the job," Osmar said, simple as ever. "The rest is just talk." Jonas smiled faintly at the phrase, remembering that it was practically the same thing his own grandfather used to say, only applied to nets and not resumes. He returned to the office that afternoon, reread the notes he had taken during each interview of the week, and compared the practical experience of each candidate point by point, without letting any old feelings influence the finalist. That was precisely the criterion Jonas used. He reviewed each candidate's answers, compared experience, compared the clarity of explanations during the interview, and concluded that Camila truly had the practical knowledge the position required. She knew how to deal with delayed suppliers, knew how to organize complicated orders, knew how to talk to difficult clients without losing her patience. She was exactly the profile he needed for that moment of the company's growth. He decided to hire her for the same salary he would offer anyone else with that experience, without deducting anything because of their past, without increasing anything out of pity or any lingering old feelings. He judged her by her work, not by her current position in life. It was exactly the criterion he would have liked them to have used with him 2 years earlier, when he was just a fisherman with a small boat and a dream too big for some. He called Camila on a Thursday afternoon. She answered on the second ring, her voice a little tight with nervousness. "Camila," Jonas said, getting straight to the point. "You're hired. You can start Monday, if that's okay with you." On the other end of the line, she was silent for a moment, feeling her eyes fill with tears, without even understanding the exact reason. It wasn't just financial relief. It was something deeper, linked to finally being seen for what she could do, not for the label she herself had placed on him years ago. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. "I won't disappoint you." "I know you won't," Jonas replied simply before saying goodbye and hanging up. The following Monday, Camila arrived early for her first day of work, carefully dressed, the same nervousness from the interview still present, but now mixed with a genuine desire to do everything right. Jonas introduced her to the small team, 2 employees for sorting, a driver who made the larger deliveries, and Aline, who was responsible for the financial side. Each greeted Camila with a simple handshake, without any visible curiosity about her past with the owner. Soon she was sitting at an organized desk, managing orders and supplier contacts, exactly as she had done for almost 2 years at the previous distributor. The first few days were a quiet adaptation. Camila worked with double attention, always pulling her own weight, not expecting special treatment from anyone because of the past. Jonas maintained a professional distance, treating her as he treated any other employee, with respect and fair expectations. One afternoon, a few weeks later, a supplier called, complaining about an incorrectly charged amount, and Camila resolved the problem herself, calmly, without needing to call Jonas to intervene. Passing by her desk at that moment, he heard only the end of the call and walked on without comment, just a nod that was worth more than any praise. It was on one of those afternoons that Osmar appeared in the office, bringing a box of fresh shrimp for Jonas to personally check before delivery. He greeted Camila with a polite nod, showing no surprise. Jonas had already told him in a few words who had been hired. Osmar made no comment about the matter, only asked if she was adapting well to the job. He waited for her answer with genuine attention and then went to talk to Jonas about the next delivery, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Months later, on a morning like any other, Jonas went out to sea before the sun fully rose, just as he always did, even though he no longer needed that specific money to survive. He did it because he loved it, because that solitary moment on the water continued to be the place where he felt most like himself. The air was cold, the motor's hum echoing softly on the still water, and the horizon lines still dark, slowly mixing blue with faint orange. As he pulled the net back into the boat, he briefly thought of that day in the yard, of the phrase Camila had uttered in front of the neighbors. He felt no anger, no desire to prove anything to anyone anymore. He was still the same man who could read the water before any contract. Only now, that knowledge had become the foundation of something much bigger. The boat glided slowly back to shore, gulls cutting across the gradually brightening sky, the sun beating strong on the water. And so, without speeches and without an audience, the story of Jonas and Camila found its true conclusion. Camila thought she knew Jonas's future just because she knew the boat he had at that moment. But a simple profession was never synonymous with a small future. Jonas didn't need to stop being a fisherman to prove his worth. He simply transformed what he knew into the foundation of everything he built. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of this story. Never determine how far someone can go by looking only at where they are today. Now, tell me in the comments, would you have given Camila the job after everything she said and did? And if you love stories where time holds everyone accountable for their choices, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.